Stabhakaya Chatalmasya Sarvadharma Swarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. O Ramakrishna, establisher of the universal religion, embodiment of all religions, to thee, the noblest of divine incarnations, I offer my salutations. We pick up again some reflections on Sri Ramakrishna. So we are told today that in modernizing countries, there is an increase in what is called secularism, away from conventional religion. By the same token, there is also an increase in movements where religions of different types, cultures of different types, want to get together to understand each other. Here in Dublin, we are part of a Dublin City Interfaith Forum that really acts as an interfaith organization for the whole of Ireland, and also interacts with other interfaith organizations worldwide. A long time ago, in the 20th century, there was, after the First World War, what was called the Great War, a need to develop something like a League of Nations, where people had a greater understanding of each other. And so there's a new surge, it seems, for people to get out of their individual sectarian niches and at least talk to one another. It didn't used to be like that. There were pockets of cooperation here and there. For example, there were attempts in India at some point to have some dialogue, but it failed because it was more kind of bargaining process that highlighted theological differences and how we can reconcile them. But today the world has decreased in size by virtue of the fact that communication and travel is much easier. And so in the opening prayer, we mentioned Sri Ramakrishna as a kind of prophet of the New Age. And when we say New Age, we mean some particular moment in time that carries its momentum for many, many centuries. He's an establisher of a universal religion. Is there such a thing as a universal religion? Because if you then say to many, many people who are following some kind of organized religious path that all religions are true, it will be an astonishing statement for them, because they'll say, no, either my religion is true and your religion is false, or the other way around, but not all religions can be true. And so in Sri Ramakrishna's time, there were these various sectarian understandings as well. Vaishnavites were there, Shaivites were there, Shaktyites were there. And then we have among all the great young devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, the Brahmo Samaj that does not believe in any of these forms of worship. It doesn't believe in a personal God, considers any form of worship to any physical representation of God as idolatry, picking it up from British influences. But Ramakrishna doesn't know anything about this. Ramakrishna has a very simple, pure, divine outlook that is instantly unifying. And so there's a whole series of conversations that take place on, it so happens to be, September 19th. This is in the Gospel of Ramakrishna, in the chapter 28, entitled At the Star Theatre. And all of the recollections are dated Friday, September 19th, 1884. Some 2 years before Sri Ramakrishna's final Mahasamadhi. In there's a very curious dialogue, because a visitor comes to Sri Ramakrishna. And the visitor was clearly a Vaishnavite, not just a Vaishnavite, but a follower of the Vaishnavite sect established by Sri Gauranga or Sri Chaitanya and his descendants. And so the dialogue goes like this, and the setting goes like this. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The master had been conversing with the Mukherjee brothers and the other devotees when Radhika Goswami, the name tells it, a Vaishnava scholar, arrived and bowed before him. This was his first visit to the master. Radhika Goswami took a seat. So the master asks him, are you a descendant of Advaita? Advaita doesn't mean non-dualistic philosophy. It means Advaita is an intimate companion of Sri Chaitanya. Are you in that lineage? Yes, sir, he says. And at this, the master saluted him with folded hands. Imagine. Can we say that Sri Ramakrishna was exclusively a Vaishnavite? No. In fact, when he visited all the shrines, when he first meets Nag Mahashe, he takes him around all the various temples and shrines within the Dakshinaswara complex, which itself has a mix of religious traditions and understandings. The central temple is dedicated to Mother Kali. So it would please the Tantrikas and the Shaivites, Shaktyites. But then along the sides, temples to Shiva. And then there's a Vaishnavite temple, dedicated, the Radhakanta temple. So there's a mix of at least 3 traditions, all in one place. And there's Ramakrishna in the midst of it all. But when he goes to and perambulates the Mother Kali, his whole mood changes. And he starts being the mother's child, catching her dress, going into a state of bhava. But a wonderful transformation is noticed at this point. And so he puts all that aside, and he's now making a salutation to this Vaishnavite. And the master says, you are descended from Radhika Goswami, you must have inherited some of his traits. He starts off with a compliment. A sweet mango tree produces only sweet mangoes and not sour ones, tainted with a little humor. Of course, it happens that some trees produce large mangoes and some small. That depends on the soil. Isn't that true? There's a kind of humor coming on. Goswami, humbly, he says, sir, what do I know? And the master, whatever you may say, others will not tell you off so easily. Brahmins, however imperfect they may be, are worshipped by all on account of their having been born in the lines of great sages. That's the idea. All the Brahmins will trace their ancestry back to a certain Gotra that is there, named after a Rishi. So tell us the story then of Sham Kuchila. That is the story, of course, where Kamsa decides to do away with all the children of Vasudeva and Devaki because of the prediction that the 8th child will be his destruction. And as we know from the story, Vasudeva managed miraculously to cross the river and go to the village there of Nanda and exchange the child. And there, Nanda and his wife Yashoda had just had a baby girl. And the daughter was in fact the incarnation of the divine Shakti, the power. And she transforms herself into this bird which is similar to a kite. And from there on, that bird is worshipped in memory of that. And what it means is that we can use all these stories And we can use all these symbols and indications to constantly remind us of the divine. So there's a story in the offing, and all of this is within the scope of Vaishnavism, because this story is told in the Bhagavatam. Now M, who's the author of this, Vendranath Gupta, sat in silence because it was obviously directed to him. Will you tell a story? And then the master says, if one of your ancestors was a great soul, he will certainly pull you up, however unworthy you may be. When King Duryodhana and his brothers were taken captive by the Gandhars, Yudhishthira released them in spite of the fact that King Duryodhana was his enemy and had banished him to the forest. Besides, one must show respect to the religious garb. Even the mere garb recalls to mind the real object. And then he says how Chaitanya once dressed an ass in a religious garb and then prostrated himself before it. There was a question, I forget when it was, probably on Thursday, where it was asked, in fact it was yesterday, Sri Ramakrishna had the reputation of being mad. It came back to the ears of the Holy Mother. And all the Mother Grundis of the village made it very unpleasant because of the tittle-tattling and the gossip that went on. And the question was, you see, do all incarnations and holy people go through this? So the whole of the session was in connection with the answer to that question. But imagine now, this Sri Chaitanya who inspires others with a simple formula of singing God's name in kirtan. And he does something that you and I would consider to be a little eccentric at the most, or at the least. Take a donkey, dress it up in religious garb, and then prostrate to it. Other people scratching their head and said, well, he was sane a few moments ago, but now I'm not so sure. So why do people bow before any symbol like this with such great sensitivity? So when Kamsa was about to kill the Divine Mother, she flew away from the form of a Samkachila. So even now, people salute this bird. That's the idea. Then he makes a remarkable statement, because don't forget, the English Raj is operating at the time. And he says, an Englishman arrived at the cantonment of Chanak. The sepoys saluted him. Kaur Singh explained to me, India is under the rule of the English, therefore one should salute an Englishman. Now you see, what is he saying here? It comes in the next sentence. He says, the Shaktas follow the Tantra and the Vaishnavas the Purana. There is no harm for the Vaishnavas in speaking publicly of their spiritual practices, but the Shaktas, they're different. They maintain secrecy about theirs. For this reason, it is difficult to understand a Shakta. You can see he's leading up to the point whereby biographers of Ramakrishna who have a certain sectarian bias will claim them as his own. What was Ramakrishna? Was he a tantric? Yes. Was he a Shakti? Yes. Was he a Vaishnavite? Oh, yeah. Was he a Shaivite? Yes. Was he an Advaitin? Oh, yes. Did he belong to the Brahma Samaj? Yes. He simply adapted, as any good teacher would, without criticizing. So the Vaishnavites, he would, as we have seen, talk in Vaishnavite language. And had there been a Christian there, what do you think might happen? He would talk in the language of Jesus. Or had there been a Muslim there, he would talk in the language of Muhammad. So we can see the breadth of this unifying breadth that Sri Ramakrishna has. And how is it relevant to this age? More than ever. So it goes on. He goes to turns to Goswami. You're all good people. That is you, the descendants of Chaitanya. You're all good people. In this day and age, we have it. You know, when I walk down the street in Dublin, ignoring the fact that I'm a bearded entity, people say, oh, you know, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. See? And I happily say Hare Krishna back. Let them think that I'm part of ISKCON, it's all right. So you see, even in this day and age here, throughout the world, a version of this Gauri sect or Gaudiya sect has traveled the world. And we see people singing everywhere in Russia and in Spain and everywhere, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. So he says, you are all good people. We don't criticize anybody. How much japa you practice, how much you chant the name of Hari. And Goswami humbly says, oh no, we do very little. I'm a great sinner. And the master smiling, you have humility, that is good, but there is also another way. Now, you have humility. But now there are people who are involved in the sect, any sect, many sects, who don't have that humility. They say, you know, our way is the only way. And Ramakrishna is saying, oh, this is a good way. There's another way also. So you have humility, that is good, but there is also another way. I chant the name of Hari. How can I be a sinner? I chant the name of Hari. Yes, you chant the name, that's good. But I'm a sinner. How can it be both? How can you take the Lord's name on the one hand and be a sinner on the other? Once you have the Lord's name, you have everything. In another conversation, somebody says, how can we know God? Well, you may not know God, but you know His name. Take His name. That's all you have to do. So, he who constantly repeats, I am a sinner, I am a wretch, truly becomes a sinner. What lack of faith! A man chants the name of God so much, and still he talks of sin. And you'll see many, many religious organizations with their particular theology that start off from that point, I am a sinner. And yes, we can apologize to somebody, we've done some wrong to somebody, but should we apologize and then 5 minutes later, and I'm so sorry. And then another 2 minutes later, oh, please forgive me. And then tomorrow you come, or the next day, you know, oh, by the way, phone a person up. I have to apologize. How many times will you do that? Surely once is enough. If you have faith in the forgiving power of the other side, that's enough. Move on. Don't say why not, what next? Move on. It's past, it's gone. So chanting the name of God is a kind of infilling thing that displaces sin. You can't have the two. And that, what a wonderful teaching, even in this brief conversation, on the ground, on the same level, the same understanding that Goswami is working on and understanding on his level, with his teachings, with his understandings of japa. Radhika Goswami listened to these words in amazement. We assume he never heard something like that before. How will you overcome your sins and your dependency? With love mixed with guilt, sing God's name? No. With the love, yes, but leave the guilt out. That's a lack of faith. So the master goes on, at Vrindavan, I myself put on the garb of the Vaishnavas. He didn't have to say that. But at Vrindavan, when he was there, he puts on the same clothing as the Vaishnavas. And wore it for about, well, he says 15 days, so 2 weeks, a fortnight. And then he turns to devotees and says, I have practiced the disciplines of all the paths, each for a few days. Otherwise, I should have found no peace of mind. Now, so imagine now, somebody says, I don't know anything about religion. I live in a modernized society, and there's a decline in religion and an increase in secularism. Which religion should I practice? Well, if you're not sure, why don't you see if there's truth in all of them? At least investigate the mystics, that is, those who've had that direct experience in all religions. Then we come then, for example, to the Sufi aspect, that mystical portion of Islam, and we read there this emotional state of power, this union of the lover and the beloved in all the language of Ibn Arabi, that great Sufi mystic. And then we see it in the Eastern Orthodox Church of Christianity, this goal of union through inner prayer, this interior movement, this shift inward. And then we see the life of all the Christian mystics. We see Antony of Egypt living a hermetic life with that same impulse and instinct, going inward, all going inward. And so in all the paths, if you go inward, you'll surely arrive at the same destination. So he would have found no peace. And after this, the recorder says, smiling. How many times do we see in all of these conversations this word, smiling? The master's face beaming, this with an undercurrent of good humor and gentleness and politeness and humility. He says, I have practiced all the disciplines. I accept all paths. He's not quibbling. Puts it straight. I accept all paths. I respect the Shaktas, the Vaishnavas, and the Vedantins. Therefore, people of all sects come here. And when he says here, he means physically here. He means Ramakrishna. He doesn't mean Dakshinaswar, but of course, Dakshinaswar, yeah, but here, to this entity. Because I will adapt. I will understand the other person's point of view and do what is necessary. Now, I mentioned Nag Maharshi. On his first meeting with the master, he wanted to touch the master's feet, and the master recoiled and prevented it. And Nag Maharshi was a very pure and saintly soul. Nag Maharshi was told about the value of the life of a householder on his first meeting. That was enough for him. On the second occasion, and he still heartsore that I can't touch the master's feet. My one desire is I should touch his feet. Now, he was also a doctor. Anyway, it so happened that he was showing Nag Maharshi around all the temples, him and others all around the temples. But when it came there to the Kali temple, this transformation, as I said, took place. Nag Maharshi was overawed. But then, of course, he said, I have all kinds of health difficulties and so on and so forth, burning sensations and what have you. What's wrong with me? You're a doctor. Please examine my legs. And in examining the legs, he said, no, legs, and the feet. And you can see the insight he had. Nag Maharshi was overjoyed and understood immediately. He understood my pangs. And now he's making not just the feet, but the whole legs. So this is the wonderful nature of Sri Ramakrishna, who had the adaptability and the insight into another's soul instantly. Now he goes on to say, and every one of them, every one of what? Whether it doesn't matter what you are, whatever sect you belong to, every one of them thinks that I belong to his school. That was the interesting craft that he had, the skill that he had. And he said, I also respect the modern Brahmañanis. He was talking about the Brahma Samaj, who are modern because they don't go in for the traditional images and form-filled gods and worship And all the sects that I have just mentioned, they have something different. They're influenced by those who say you should not worship graven images and so on, all coming from the Western culture, the Abrahamic religions. And from the Abrahamic religion side, the word idolatry is anathema. And all the images and so on and so forth that are there are deemed to be weird and strange. And they're all there, priests and mullahs and what have you. And rabbis will say that this is demonic also. Because it's weird, it's strange. Nobody grew up with that. There's a beautiful picture of that particular Dakshinaswar Kali sitting in a room upstairs. It was suggested that we bring it down some years ago, 3 years ago, and display it in the shrine. And I said, people who come here from other religions will not understand this, particularly in a Roman Catholic cultural country such as Ireland. So there is a lack of understanding from the other person's point of view that creates all kinds of conflict. When we understand what it means, when people take the time and trouble to explain it, then it becomes different. That requires patience, it requires compassion, it requires open-mindedness. All of these qualities Sri Ramakrishna has. And he has it on the basis of his own experience. He never taught anything that he himself didn't practice and experience himself. Then he gives this wonderful, wonderful teaching, this wonderful analogy about the tub with dye in. He says, a man had a tub of dye. Such was his wonderful property that people could dye their clothes any color they wanted by merely dipping them in it. And a clever man said to the owner of the tub, please dye my cloth the color of your dye stuff. And it's recorded that all laugh. So we have to adapt. Whatever is the dye color, why not? Why should I be one-sided, he goes on to say. See, he's really laboring the point. Why should I be one-sided? And we can also ask that question ourselves, why should we be one-sided? Why should anybody be one-sided? The idea that the people of a particular sect will not come to me doesn't frighten me. I don't care a bit whether people come to me or not. See, people are anxious when they start a new Vedanta center. Oh, will people come? Will people come? One is enough. People come by themselves. Because do we want crowds of people? Vivekananda went on these organized lecture tours, and he soon found out his most precious moments were reserved for his most precious teachings with a select handful of people who were interested, yearning for the truth, who were thirsty for it. The thought of keeping anyone under my control never crosses my mind, he says. We take some of the religious difficulties from different religions and different sects. That's the difficulty. There's a controlling aspect of it. You join me, if you join me, then I'll give you an education, but you have to change your name to a Christian name. Throughout India, there are many Indians with Christian names in the older generation because they wanted an education. Imagine. So, no control of the mind. And today there are what Ramakrishna called maybe commercial gurus. And their understanding is, I want to control you. Or there's an organization, let me control you in one way or another. But he has no understanding of that, no thought about that, completely open-minded. I'm not adapting myself to control you. I'm adapting myself so that we can understand each other and then discover together this universal truth. Athas Sen asked me to ask the Divine Mother for a big position for him. But he didn't get it. If that makes him think differently about me, what do I care? Oh, I won't go to him again because I tried to get a big position and so nothing happened. So that's all right. Find another person. So that is often what happens. People come to an ashram perhaps, or even a temple to get something. And if that doesn't happen, they're like a spoiled child. They say, oh, I'll try the next temple. Once at Keshav House, he goes on, I found myself in a new mood. The Brahmins always speak of the impersonal. Therefore, I said to the Divine Mother in an ecstatic mood, Mother, please don't come here. They don't believe in your forms. Please stay away. Radhika Goswami listened to these words of the Master against sectarianism and remained silent. And the Master, again smiling, Vijay, he's talking of Vijay Krishna Goswami. Vijay Krishna Goswami, though he was born in a Vaishnava family, he became a member of the Brahma Samaj, but later he returned to the worship of a personal God. So he says, so he uses him as an example. Vijay is in a wonderful state of mind nowadays. He falls to the ground while chanting the name of Hari. He devotes himself to kirtan, meditation, and other spiritual practices till 4 in the morning. He now puts on an ochre robe and prostrates himself before the images of God. Once he accompanied me to Gadadhar's schoolhouse. Gadadhar was a celebrated Vaishnava saint. And I pointed out the place where he used to meditate. At once Vijay prostrated himself there. Again he fell prostrate before the picture of Chaitanya Deva. Then Goswami starts to speak. He says, what about the image of Radha Krishna? Because you see, in that form of Vaishnavism, you see how Radha is put first. Radha Krishna. And the Master, and it's deemed to be one and the same thing. And the Master, don't forget, Ramakrishna himself dressed as a woman to get this feeling of intimate, personal love, similar to the illicit love of a woman for a man. That is Radha to Krishna. And the Master, he prostrated himself there too. Vijay also follows all the conventions of religious life. And Goswami, he can now be accepted in Vaishnava society. Now that he's left all the Brahmas, he can come and join us, that's okay. And the Master says, people's opinions don't count for much with him. He doesn't care for acceptance or not. He's a real devotee. In no way is he sectarian. And Goswami, no, I don't mean that. By accepting him, Vaishnava society will honor itself. It'll be a feather in the cap of the Vaishnavas. And the Master says, oh, he respects me very much, but it's difficult to reach him. One day he is called to Dhaka, the next to some other place. He is always busy. His presence has created great trouble in the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. Why so, sir? You know, the Brahmins tell him, you mix with people who worship God with form. You are an idolater. Vijay is liberal and straightforward, unless a man is guileless like a child. He doesn't receive the grace of God. A wonderful statement. Because Sri Ramakrishna is also guileless like a child, shifting his moods as appropriate, giving paternal and maternal advice to some, and acting as a child to others. Mahapurush Maharaj, Swami Shivananda, recalls his first meetings with Ramakrishna, and somehow he has the feeling that Ramakrishna is like a mother because he receives motherly love. He recalls like this. For many years, I had been eager to explore and understand the nature of samadhi. I sincerely wanted to know exactly what it was. I had questioned many people, but no one had been able to explain it to me. One person, however, had said, "No one can realize samadhi in this age." I have seen only one man who has, and that is Ramakrishna Paramahansa of Dakshinaswar. And that evening, he recalls, I went to Ram Babu's house. And I found the master sitting in a room crowded with people. The master was in an ecstatic mood. I saluted him and sat nearby. One can well imagine my surprise when I heard him talking eloquently on a subject that I had been so eager to know about, samadhi. I remember that he elaborated on Nirvikalpa Samadhi, a transcendental experience. He said that very few can attain it, and that if one attained it, one's body dropped off in 21 days. I did not talk to the master on that occasion. A month later, I went to Dakshinaswar, and I became acquainted with him. And in the dim light of an oil lamp, I saw the master seated cross-legged in his room with 3 or 4 others on the floor in front of him. The small audience suited me. At once, I felt a deep attachment for the master. I felt as if I had known him a long time. My heart became filled with joy. I saw in him my tender, loving mother waiting for me. So with the confidence, faith, and certitude of a child, I surrendered myself to him, placing myself entirely under his care. I was certain that at last I had found him for whom I had been searching all these days. The portrait of Sri Ramakrishna as a child is transformed now into an image of the mother. And from then on, he says, I looked upon the master as my mother. And after this momentous visit, my life at home and work at the office became a burden. I often ran to see him, either in Dakshinaswar or Calcutta. During my 2nd or 3rd visit, I was serving him when he suddenly touched my chest in an ecstatic mood. That touch made me lose outer consciousness and sent me into a deep meditative state. I do not know how long I remained in that state. As a result, everything became revealed to me. I realized that I was the Atman, eternal and free. Other people, he guided them toward singing Hari's name, singing the Lord's name, devotion, singing, dancing. When Naran, who became Vivekananda, first went to him, he said, he came to me in very dirty clothes, and he only knew 2 songs. But his devotion increased and he learned many more. But here, he did something that suited exactly the personality. And that is why he became Swami Shivananda, the characteristics of Shiva. So he realized that he was the Atman, eternal and free. I realized, he says, that the master was the Lord, born as a man for the good of humanity, and that I was on earth to serve him. He gave me a similar blessing another day under the banyan tree in the Panchavati. Nevertheless, the master would not allow us to rest on our laurels, but would constantly urge us with infinite patience to taste the fruits of realization through our own efforts. He watched our efforts and directed us to go forward according to our temperament and at our own pace. How else could you do it? He was a psychologist, understanding people's individual personality and temperament. We have to use other means like the Enneagram and so on, but he knew this is for that person, not for another person. Bigotry and fanaticism had no place in his life or teaching. He would accept people of all denominations with the same love and sympathy. To come in contact with him was to become spiritual forever. To live with him was to live in the presence of God. he carries on and says, when we visited him, the thought of whether or not he was a divine incarnation never crossed our minds. We could not foresee that he would create such a superhuman movement throughout the world. Who could know then that the whole world would become intoxicated with this man, only 3.5 cubits tall? He loved us very much. It was the depth of his love that drew us to him. And in the same section of this Gospel of Ramakrishna, we see his reference to pining for Rakal, who has gone to Vrindavan, and mentions how the peacocks are there and so on and so forth. And he's anxious for him, knowing his prehistory in another incarnation. So this love, incomparable. Human love is not actually like that. So he goes on to say, it was the depth of his love that drew us to him. How shall I describe his love? It was ineffable. In our childhood, we had had the experience of parental affection and did not think there could be anything greater. But when we came to the Master and felt his love, we found the affection of our parents to be of a lesser kind. And after coming to him, we felt that we had arrived home, that all of those previous years we had been roaming about in a strange country. Whenever I came to Sri Ramakrishna, that was how I felt. I do not know how others felt. The Master won me over at my very first meeting. And Ramakrishna himself echoes this from his side. He says, one day, he said, well, so many people come here, I seldom ask anybody about his home and family or desire to know anything about these things. Because he's seeing the same God everywhere and everyone. But when I first met you, I felt that you belonged here, he says to Tarak, Swami Shivananda, that I would like to know the particulars of your home, parents and the like. Can you tell me why? He's asking, why did I feel this? Where is your home? What is your father's name? And the reply was all given, and hearing the reply, the Master said, oh, indeed, because he knew his father. In later episodes, we see how Tarak Maharaj, that is Mahapurush Maharaj, Shivananda, wanted to carry his water pot, and he refused, and he was very offended by that. He said, how you allow everybody to give you service, but not me? And then it turned out that Ramakrishna viewed his father as a kind of guru. So the subtlety of Ramakrishna's dealings is wonderful. The son of the guru is the same as the guru, is the tradition. So Sri Ramakrishna talked to the Mukherjee brothers, coming back to his conversations. Mahendra the elder had his own business, and then Priyanath the younger had been an engineer. After making some provision for himself, he had given up his job. Mahendra was 35 or 36 years old. The brothers had homes both in the country and in Kolkata. Mahendra always gives a setting so that we understand the context of a conversation. The Master, again, smiling, don't sit idle simply because your spiritual consciousness has been awakened a little. Go forward, beyond the forest of sandalwood, referring to his parable of going beyond into the forest. Go further, go further, go further. And there are other more valuable things, silver mines, gold mines, and so on. Priya, smiling, sir, our legs are in chains, we cannot go forward. There's another version of we are the sinners and impossible to go forward. But the Master is positive, upbeat, always encouraging. So he says, what if the legs are chained? The important thing is the mind. Bondage is of the mind. Freedom is also of the mind. Again, a sense of humor has nothing to do with the legs. Listen to a story, and then he tells a story. There were two friends. One went into a house of prostitution and the other to hear a recital of the Bhagavata. What a shame, thought the first. My friend is hearing spiritual discourse, but just see what I have slipped down to. And the second friend said to himself, shame on me, my friend is having a good time. But how stupid I am. After death, the soul of the first was taken to Vaikuntha by the messenger of Vishnu, because he's still talking to Vaishnavites. Yeah. While that of the second was taken to the netherworld of Yama. And Priya, but the mind is not under my control. This is a common question that spiritual seekers have. And the master, how is that? There is such a thing as abhyasa yoga, yoga through practice. There's something that everybody can do. It doesn't matter how low you think yourself or how weak you think yourself. There's always something you can do. There's an echo of the 12th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna himself is saying, the first thing is, please fix your mind on me. If you can't do that, constant practice, bring the mind back. Abhyasa yoga. Keep up the practice and you'll find that your mind will follow in whatever direction you lead it. The mind is like a white cloth just returned from the laundry. It will be red if you dip it in red dye, second reference to the dye. And blue if you dip it in blue. It will have whatever color you dip it into. You dip it into worldliness, that's what will happen. Dip it into selfishness, that's what will happen. Dip it into divine glory, that is what will happen. And then to Goswami he says, have you anything to ask? Goswami says, no sir, I am satisfied. I am satisfied that I have seen you and have been listening to your words. And then the master ends the conversation in a normal way that he always does. Go and visit the temples. That's his last word. Go and visit the temples. Here's another way of saying, we've concluded our business, thank you. Go and see the temples. Not go away. I say go away, but he says, no, go and visit the temples. He says, continue absorbing the atmosphere of the place and do it in a mindful way is his suggestion. And Goswami, very humbly, he doesn't want to leave. He says, won't you sing something about Sri Chaitanya? And so the master complies. Things are not finished. And then he sings the song translated as, why has my body turned so golden? It is not time for this to be Gauranga, you see, golden. Many the ages that must pass before as Gauranga I appear. And then again, Gaura gazes at Vrindavan and tears stream from his eyes. In an exuberance of joy, he laughs and weeps and dances and sings. He takes a wood for Vrindavan, the ocean for the blue Yamuna. He rolls on the ground for love of Hari. And after singing, the master went on still with the conversation. We'll end off with some small excerpts from this conversation. So the master says to Goswami, I have sung these songs to suit your Vaishnava temperament. See that? But I must sing differently when the Shaktas or others come. He's carrying the same theme on of this universality. Here, people of all sects come. Here, always referring to himself. When he says here, he's referring to himself. Here, people of all sects come, Vaishnavas, Shaktas, Karta, Bhajas, Vedantists, and also members of the modern Brahma Samaj. He says it again. Therefore, one finds here all ideals and attitudes. It is by the will of God that different religions and opinions have come into existence. It's not just that they're different. It's by God's will that they have come into existence also. We can't say one is right, one is wrong. God's will made it like that. God gives us different people, or gives to different people what they can digest. So even people in the same religion, He gives them enough for them to digest. We know in the Vedanta philosophy that all religious approaches fit broadly into three categories. The dualists who want to worship God, either externally or internally. And that internal movement leads them to seeing God's grace pouring out everywhere and seeing everything as a spark of the divine. And this is called Vishishtadvaita. And then ultimately that leads them to a realization of a oneness, and this we call Advaita. So even within different religions and different religious progress, there are different steps. A good teacher will take you not to the last one, but the first one. And you may be sitting naturally on the third rung. Go there, but see the adaptability of a wonderful teacher, such as Sri Ramakrishna. The mother does not give fish pilau to all her children. All cannot digest it. So she prepares simple fish soup for some. Everyone cherishes his own special ideal and follows his own nature. They provide various images for the Barwari because people of different sects, let's say a religious festival, because people of different sects assemble at it. You see their images of Radha Krishna, Shiva, Durga, and Sita Rama in different images in different places. A crowd gathers before each one. The Vaishnavas spend most of their time before the image of Radha Krishna. The Shaktas before Shiva Durga, and the devotees of Rama before Sita Rama. Then he goes on to say, but it is quite different with those who are not spiritually minded at all. And after all this conversation, which he finishes off like this, those people stand there and gaping mouths cry to their friends, what are you looking at over there? Come here, look at this. And then the master says, both to him and the others, why should I be one-sided? That's the second time he said it. The Goswamis belong to the Vaishnava school and are very bigoted. They think that their opinion alone is right and all other opinions are wrong. And we can extend that to other religions in the world today. My words, he says, have hit him hard. One man must strike the elephant on the head with the goad. And that is the elephant's most sensitive spot. Then Sri Ramakrishna said a few youthful jokes, we can be polite about it, for the young men, all creating a spirit of joy and fellowship. Why does he do that? Just for your information. Because he says, I don't give the youngsters a pure vegetarian diet. Now and then I give them a little water smelling of fish. Otherwise, why should they come? And so that was a significant part of this conversation that is recorded broadly September 19th, 1884. It is quite evident then from what we have read and studied, the breadth of vision that Sri Ramakrishna has and how it's relevant to today, how it's relevant to the diversity that necessitates interfaith movements that are based on real understanding. In the current interfaith movement that we have here in Ireland, centered in Dublin, the understanding of this fundamental truth and reality is something that is logically acceptable and yet strange. And I like to think that as a Vedanta society, we are making inroads into that attitudes and saying, look, there is an undercurrent that we all agree on, and it is only on this undercurrent basis that we can find our unity and understanding. Otherwise, if you make religion a question of bargaining, I knock out this doctrine if you accept this one. The Vatican Council that was there made an attempt to do that erroneously, and now there's a split between the traditionalists and the more liberal-minded. And so there's a crisis going on, which is part and parcel of the secularism that is part and parcel in its turn of modernization. So where does this Vedanta fit into, and this broad attitude of Sri Ramakrishna fit into a modern world where it is increasingly modernizing and secularism is taking over? Statistically, that's the case, to the extent that if the trend continues, it is irreversible. We have to teach the fundamental truths and the breadth that Sri Ramakrishna has taught, and do it in with the same sense of fun and unity that he did it. Not being afraid of firing away also at those who are bigoted. And he had the wonderful knack of doing that. And you can see almost visibly the great transformation in Goswami that took place from this conversation. So we leave it there. And not only the transformation, I should additionally mention, but also he's reluctant to go off and visit the temples. He wants Ramakrishna to sing a song, and in the style of Chaitanya too. So with those thoughts and reflections on Sri Ramakrishna, we leave it there. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.